When people think of firefighters, they usually picture flames, roaring infernos bright orange against the night sky. But some of the worst calls are the ones with no fire at all. It was a cold February night when we got dispatched to what the captain called a unique situation. Those two words, spoken with a slight hesitation, were enough to put me on edge. The address was a construction site on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of half-finished buildings. The developer was trying to put up a new apartment complex, but the work had stalled for months. I'd driven past the site before. It always looked desolate, like a skeleton waiting for life to fill it. We arrived to find 2 police cruisers parked near the entrance. A young officer, barely out of the academy by the look of him, jogged up to us as we climbed out of the engine. He was pale, his breath visible in the frigid air as he tried to explain the situation. A worker had gone missing earlier in the day, and now there was a strong smell of gas coming from one of the lower levels of the building. The officer didn't have to say it out loud, but the implication was clear. Missing person plus gas leak could mean one thing. Someone was trapped or worse. Our captain didn't waste time. He divided us into teams to search the building, with clear instructions to proceed cautiously. Gas leaks are unpredictable, and one spark, one wrong move, could end the night in a disaster. I paired up with Walker, a seasoned firefighter with a dry sense of humor that usually helped keep things light. Tonight, though, neither of us felt much like joking. The building was a maze of concrete and steel, unfinished walls casting long shadows under the flickering emergency lights. The smell of gas was faint at first but grew stronger as we descended. Walker muttered something about cutting corners on safety protocols, and I had to agree. The place was a disaster waiting to happen. On the 3rd level down, we found a hard hat lying on the ground. It was scuffed and dented, as if it had been dropped or thrown. Nearby was a thermos, its lid askew. Walker picked it up and sniffed, wrinkling his nose. Coffee, long gone cold. We called out, our voices echoing off the concrete walls. No response. The smell of gas was overpowering now, making my eyes water and my throat burn. Further down the corridor, we found a set of footprints in the dust. They were erratic, zigzagging as if the person had been stumbling. We followed them to a metal door marked sub-basement access. It was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as we pushed it open. The stairwell beyond was pitch black. Our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, the beams cutting through the haze of gas that hung in the air. Every step echoed unervingly, the sound swallowed up by the oppressive silence. At the bottom of the stairs, we found him. The worker was slumped against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was alive, but barely. His eyes fluttered open when we approached, and he mumbled something incoherent. Walker leaned in close, trying to make sense of the words. The man kept repeating the same phrase, "They're still down there." We exchanged a glance, unease settling in the pit of my stomach. Was there someone else? It didn't seem likely. No one had reported another missing person. But we couldn't take the chance. Walker radioed for medical assistance while I tried to get more information from the worker. His breathing was shallow, his words slurred. The gas had clearly affected him, and we needed to get him out fast. As we prepared to move him, there was a sound from deeper in the sub-basement. A faint metallic clanging, like something striking a pipe. Walker froze, his eyes narrowing. He whispered that we needed to check it out, even though every instinct in me screamed to leave. With the worker stabilized and backup on the way, we ventured further into the sub-basement, following the sound. The air grew colder, the gas thicker. Our flashlights flickered as we moved cautiously through the narrow corridors. The clanging grew louder, more erratic, until we rounded a corner and found its source. A pipe had burst, spewing gas into the confined space. A piece of debris dangled from a support beam above, swaying with each gust of air and striking the pipe. The noise had been mechanical, not human. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The beam supporting the debris looked precarious, and the gas leak was worsening. Walker and I worked quickly to shut off the valve, but the controls were corroded and stiff. As we struggled with the valve, there was a sudden groan from above, a low, ominous sound that sent chills down my spine. Walker shouted that we had to move, and I didn't argue. We were halfway back to the stairwell when the ceiling buckled behind us. The sound was deafening, a roar of collapsing concrete and twisting metal. Dust and debris filled the air, and I could feel the floor shudder beneath my boots. When we finally emerged from the building, coughing and covered in grime, the worker was already being loaded into an ambulance. The rest of the crew was there, their faces tight with worry. The aftermath was a blur of paperwork and debriefings. The worker survived, but the sub-basement was sealed off indefinitely. They never found out why he had gone down there in the first place. He claimed he'd heard voices, but whether it was the gas affecting his mind or something else, we'll never know. What I do know is that the smell of gas still makes my stomach turn, even now. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest calls are the ones where you don't know what you're walking into until it's too late. I've been with the department for 10 years, long enough to see just about everything you can imagine. Fires don't scare me the way they used to. What gets under my skin now are the ones you can't forget. The ones that sneak up on you in quiet moments, long after the smoke clears. Started like any other Tuesday. The tone went off in the middle of dinner, pasta cooling on my plate as the dispatch came through. Structure fire, residential area, unknown if occupied. As we rolled out, the chatter in the truck was routine. Speculations about what we'd find, guesses about whether it was a kitchen fire or something worse. When we pulled up to the address, the house was already belching black smoke. It was an older two-story with a sagging roof, the kind of place that looked neglected even before the fire got to it. A neighbor ran up, waving frantically, and started shouting about the man who lived there. They said he was reclusive, rarely came outside, but his truck was in the driveway. The captain barked orders and we split into teams. I was with Ramirez, a solid guy I'd worked with on countless calls. Our job was to sweep the ground floor and confirm whether anyone was inside. As we approached the front door, I could feel the heat radiating off the walls, the kind that makes your skin prickle even through the gear. Inside, visibility was almost zero. The smoke was thick, and the air tasted like burnt plastic. Ramirez shouted something about the kitchen, and we moved in that direction, stepping over what felt like fallen debris. The place was a mess. Overturned furniture, piles of junk everywhere. Hoarder's house, I thought. In the kitchen, the fire was already eating through the walls. The cabinets were charred. The appliances melted into unrecognizable lumps. No sign of anyone. Ramirez signaled for us to move deeper into the house, so we pushed forward, calling out as we went. The living room was worse. It was like stepping into a junkyard. Broken furniture, stacks of newspapers, even old tires. And the smell was something else. Not just smoke, but something sharper, more acrid. I tried not to think about it too much. Ramirez nudged me and pointed toward a hallway. We moved cautiously, stepping over what looked like more trash. That's when I noticed the sound. A faint, irregular thumping coming from somewhere ahead. It didn't register as anything specific at first, just another strange noise in an already chaotic scene. We followed it down the hall, past rooms so packed with junk we couldn't even enter. The noise grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't until we reached the last door on the left that I realized it sounded like someone banging on a wall. Ramirez and I exchanged a look. He reached for the doorknob, and I braced myself. The door didn't budge at first, but after a couple of hard shoves, it gave way, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down. A basement. The heat was worse here, the air heavy with smoke. Ramirez gestured for me to go first, and I started down the stairs, one hand gripping the rail. The banging was louder now, more desperate. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a large, dimly lit space. The first thing I noticed was the cages. Rows of them lining the walls, some stacked 2 or 3 high. They were makeshift, cobbled together from wood and wire, and inside each one was a dog. Most of them were motionless, lying on their sides, but a few were barking weakly or pawing at the bars. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Urine, feces, and the unmistakable stink of death. Ramirez cursed under his breath, and I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't just a hoarder's house. This was something worse. We didn't have time to process it. The fire was spreading fast, and the heat was unbearable. Ramirez shouted that we had to get out, but I couldn't leave them. I radioed for backup, explaining what we'd found, then started opening cages as quickly as I could. The dogs that could move bolted for the stairs, but many were too weak or injured to go anywhere. Ramirez grabbed one of the larger ones and slung it over his shoulder. I did the same with a smaller dog, its ribs sharp against my gloves. We worked as fast as we could, but it felt like trying to empty a sinking ship with a bucket. The smoke was so thick now that I could barely see Ramirez, and the heat was like a physical force, pressing down on me. Finally, the backup team arrived. They helped us carry the remaining dogs out, but by then, the fire had consumed most of the basement. We barely made it out before the floor above collapsed. Outside, the scene was chaos. Neighbors had gathered, staring as we laid the dogs on the grass, some still coughing and wheezing. Animal control arrived soon after, and I overheard one of them saying that most of the dogs wouldn't survive the night. Later, the investigators pieced together what had happened. The man who lived there had been running an illegal dogfighting operation. The fire had started in the kitchen, likely from an unattended pot on the stove. He hadn't made it out, and they found his body in the living room, surrounded by the remains of his so-called business. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cages, heard the weak barks and desperate scratches. Fires don't scare me anymore, but the things people do, that's another story. Some calls don't start with the wail of a siren or a burst of flames. Sometimes, they creep up on you, mundane at first, until they turn into something else entirely. That's what happened the night we responded to an alarm activation at an abandoned warehouse. It was just past midnight when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, notifying us of a security alarm tripped at an old industrial site on the outskirts of town. It was a slow night, and we weren't expecting much. False alarms in empty buildings were common. The warehouse was a relic from another era, a massive brick structure that had once housed a textile factory. Now it was just a decaying shell, slated for demolition in the coming months. The place had no utilities, no recent activity, and no real reason for anyone to be there. When we arrived, the gate was open, swinging lazily in the wind. The chain that should have been securing it lay on the ground, the padlock shattered. That was the first red flag. Our captain made the call. We'd split into teams and sweep the building to make sure it was safe. The cops were on their way, but we didn't want to wait. I was paired with Johnson, a rookie who'd only been with us for a few months. He was eager and sharp, but his nerves were palpable as we stepped into the building. The air inside was heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and rust. Our flashlights swept over broken machinery and crumbling walls, the beams casting jagged shadows that made everything look more menacing than it was. The first floor was uneventful, just a lot of empty space and discarded junk. We found no signs of fire, no gas leaks, and no obvious reason for the alarm to have gone off. Johnson muttered something about raccoons or maybe a homeless person setting it off by accident. We moved to the second floor, the creaking staircase protesting under our weight. This level was more cluttered, with old desks and filing cabinets scattered about. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling. As we turned a corner, Johnson froze, his flashlight fixed on a spot ahead. I followed the beam and saw what had stopped him. A trail of footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the room. They were fresh. We called it in to the captain, who told us to proceed carefully. He reminded us that the cops were only minutes away, but I could hear the tension in his voice. We followed the footprints to a door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of shuffling came from the other side. My heart was pounding now, every instinct screaming at me to wait, but we couldn't ignore it. I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms. The footprints continued, weaving through the dust until they disappeared into one of the rooms on the left. Johnson whispered that we should wait for backup, but I shook my head. If someone was hurt or hiding, every second counted. I motioned for him to cover me as I stepped into the room. It was small and cluttered, with stacks of wooden pallets leaning against the walls. In the corner, huddled against the floor, was a man. He looked up as my flashlight hit him, his face pale and streaked with grime. His clothes were torn, and his eyes were wide with fear. I asked if he was hurt, but he just shook his head, mumbling something I couldn't make out. Johnson joined me, his flashlight illuminating the man's trembling hands. That's when we saw the blood. It wasn't his. The stains on his hands and clothes were dried, dark red, but there was no sign of any wounds. I pressed him for answers, but he just kept repeating, "I didn't mean to," over and over. We called it in and waited for the police to arrive, trying to keep the man calm. He didn't resist, but his eyes kept darting to the doorway, as if he expected someone, or something, to come through it at any moment. When the cops finally showed up, they took over, questioning the man as we stood off to the side. From what I overheard, he'd broken into the warehouse a few days earlier, looking for shelter. That night, he claimed to have seen someone else in the building, another man who attacked him without warning. The fight had been brutal, and the intruder said he'd defended himself with a piece of metal pipe he'd found on the floor. He didn't know if the other man was dead or alive, but he swore he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. The cops searched the building while we stood by, our nerves fraying with every minute. It wasn't long before they found what we were dreading. A body, crumpled and lifeless, hidden beneath a pile of debris in the basement. The aftermath was a blur of questions and reports. The intruder was taken into custody, his story corroborated by the evidence at the scene. It was ruled self-defense, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I've been to plenty of crime scenes, but that night stuck with me. Maybe it was the desolation of the warehouse, the way it seemed to swallow light and sound. Maybe it was the look in the man's eyes, haunted and hollow, as if he'd seen something far worse than what he admitted to. I never went back to that warehouse, not even after it was demolished. Some places just leave a mark, and that one left its mark on me.